the body that never moved. There's a kind of truth that bodies tell that can't be manipulated or managed or shaped to fit a preferred narrative. The body doesn't lie in the way that words can lie. It doesn't forget in the way that memory can forget. It simply exists as a record of what happened to it when and in what sequence. And when we look at what JonBenet's body tells us, not through speculation or theory, but through the biological processes that occur after someone is gone, we find evidence that reshapes everything we think we know about that night. Evidence that she was placed in one position and left there undisturbed for hours. Evidence that contradicts the idea of a chaotic kidnapping attempt gone wrong. Evidence that points instead to something more deliberate, more carefully managed, more controlled than any story about panicked intruders could ever explain. The body tells us she never left that house, that she was never meant to leave, and that whoever placed her in that basement knew exactly what they were doing when they left her there to wait in stillness while a different story was being written upstairs. Theme 1. The position that preserves truth. Let's start with what happens to a body after someone passes. There are biological processes that begin immediately and progress in predictable ways. Rigor mortis, the stiffening that occurs as chemical changes happen in the muscles, begins within hours and follows a specific progression. It starts in the smaller muscles and moves to the larger ones. And here's what matters. The position the body is in when rigor mortis sets in becomes temporarily the position the body holds. If someone is lying on their back, rigor mortis will fix them in that position. If they're on their side, same thing. The body becomes a record of how it was positioned during those critical hours. Then there's livor mortis, the settling of blood to the lowest points of the body due to gravity after circulation stops. This creates discoloration in the skin where blood pools. And like rigor mortis, it's position dependent. The pattern of livor mortis tells you what position the body was in during the hours after passing. If the pattern doesn't match the position the body is found in, it tells you the body was moved after livor mortis began to set. But if the pattern matches, it tells you something equally important. The body stayed in that position, undisturbed, long enough for these processes to complete. When we look at JonBenet's body and what the forensic evidence tells us about rigor mortis and livor mortis, we see something significant. The patterns match her final position, which means she was placed where she was found, or in a very similar position, and left there. Not moved around, not repositioned multiple times, not carried from place to place, placed once and then left alone while biology did its work. Think about what that means in the context of the kidnapping narrative. If intruders came into the house planning to take JonBenet and something went wrong and she was lost in the process, what would we expect to see? We'd expect to see evidence of chaos, of panic, of a body being moved, repositioned, handled in ways that would disrupt the normal progression of rigor mortis and livor mortis. We'd expect to see evidence that things happened quickly, messily, without the time or care to position her carefully and leave her undisturbed. But that's not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows careful positioning, deliberate placement, and then nothing. Hours of nothing. Hours where she lay in one position while biological processes ran their course, undisturbed by human intervention. Hours where whoever placed her there left her alone, made no attempt to move her, made no frantic adjustments or panicked repositioning. That stillness is revealing, because stillness requires confidence. It requires knowing that the body won't be discovered too soon. It requires being able to walk away and leave her there, knowing she'll stay undisturbed until you're ready for her to be found. And that kind of confidence, that kind of control over the timeline and the discovery, doesn't fit with the image of panicked intruders. It fits with something else entirely, something more deliberate, something that happened within a controlled environment where time could be managed and discovery could be orchestrated rather than feared. Let's think about this from multiple angles because the implications ripple out in ways that reshape our entire understanding of what happened that night. From a logical standpoint, the positioning evidence tells us about sequence and timing. If JonBenet was placed in the basement and the biological evidence shows she remained in that position for approximately 12 hours before being found, then we know several things. We know that whatever happened to her occurred many hours before she was discovered. We know that she was placed in the basement during those early hours, likely in the late night or very early morning. And we know that whoever placed her there didn't come back to move her, didn't disturb her, didn't interact with her body again until John found her. That sequence doesn't fit a kidnapping scenario. In a kidnapping, the body wouldn't be in the house at all. Or if something went wrong and the kidnappers couldn't get her out, we'd expect to see evidence of them trying, attempted moves, positioning that suggests carrying or dragging, signs of panic about what to do with a body they hadn't planned to have. But none of that is evident. What's evident is singular placement followed by extended time, placement that looks deliberate rather than desperate, time that looks managed rather than chaotic. From a philosophical perspective, the way we treat a body after someone is gone reveals something about our relationship to that person and to what's happened. In cultures around the world, there are rituals of care for the departed, washing, dressing, positioning with respect and intention. But there are also ways of treating a body that reveal guilt, shame, the need to hide. And how those two modes intersect in this case is worth examining. Because JonBenet's body shows signs of both. There's the careful positioning, laid out in a way that suggests some thought about how she would be found. But there's also the hiding, placed in a remote part of the basement behind a door, in a space that wasn't immediately searched. That combination of care and concealment tells us something about the mind of the person who placed her there. They couldn't bring themselves to treat her roughly or disrespectfully. But they also couldn't face having her discovered too soon. They needed time to think, time to prepare, time to build whatever story would be built when she was finally found. Psychologically, being able to place someone and then walk away, to leave them alone in the dark for hours, requires a specific kind of compartmentalization. You have to separate the person you knew from the body you're looking at. You have to be able to think strategically even in the face of overwhelming emotion. You have to maintain enough control to execute a plan even while dealing with guilt, shock, denial, fear. All the emotions that should be paralyzing. That level of compartmentalization is possible, but it's not common. And it's more likely in certain scenarios than others. It's more likely when the person doing the positioning is someone who has to continue functioning in the household. Someone who has to go upstairs and interact with others, make phone calls, maintain appearances. Someone who can't afford to break down completely because breaking down would mean losing control of the narrative that's being constructed. An intruder doesn't need that kind of compartmentalization. An intruder can flee, can put distance between themselves and what happened, can process their emotions in private somewhere far from the scene. But someone in the house can't flee, they have to stay, they have to function. And functioning requires the ability to wall off what you've just done, to separate yourself from it enough that you can continue operating while the body lies undisturbed in the basement. From a physiological standpoint, the undisturbed positioning tells us about the timeline in specific measurable ways. Rigor mortis typically begins within 2 to 6 hours after passing, peaks around 12 hours, and then gradually resolves over the next 12 to 24 hours. Livor mortis becomes fixed, meaning it won't change if the body is moved after approximately 8 to 12 hours. So when we look at the state of JonBenet's body when she was found and we work backward using these biological markers, we can estimate when she was lost and when she was placed in the position she was found in. And those estimates tell us she was in that basement, in that position for many hours. Long enough for rigor mortis to develop fully. Long enough for livor mortis to set and fix in patterns that matched her final position. That timeline creates problems for any narrative that involves last-minute panic or sudden changes of plan. Because you can't have someone positioned in the basement for 12 hours and also have them being moved around the house by frantic criminals who can't figure out what to do. The biological evidence is clear. She was placed once and left there, and whoever placed her knew she would remain undiscovered for those hours. Had confidence that no one would search that part of the basement until the time came for her to be found. Forensic criminology teaches us that crime scenes tell stories through what's moved and what isn't, through what's disturbed and what remains untouched. And the story this crime scene tells is one of control, not chaos, not panic, control. Someone knew where to place her, knew how to position her, knew she could be left there undisturbed while other things were managed upstairs. The ransom note, the phone call to police, the gathering of friends, the construction of a narrative that would explain her absence without pointing to the place where she actually was. That level of control speaks to familiarity with the space, knowing which part of the basement was remote enough, obscure enough, that it wouldn't be immediately searched. Knowing the rhythms of the household well enough to be confident that no one would stumble upon her accidentally during those hours. Knowing how to manage the timeline so that when she was finally found, enough time would have passed that certain biological evidence would be harder to interpret, certain timelines would be harder to establish with precision. From an anthropological perspective, the treatment of the body reflects cultural and familial values around death and concealment. In most cultures, there's a strong impulse to care for the departed, to treat them with dignity even in death. But there's also, in cases of guilt or shame, an impulse to hide. And how those impulses balance against each other tells us something about the person doing the positioning. The fact that JonBenet was positioned somewhat carefully, not thrown carelessly or treated with obvious disrespect, suggests someone who couldn't completely separate themselves from who she was. Someone who still saw her as a person deserving of some basic dignity, even while placing her in a location meant to delay discovery. That mixture of care and concealment is more consistent with someone who knew her, who had a relationship with her, than with a stranger who would have no such emotional conflict about how to treat her body. Finally, let's think about this from the perspective of someone who needs time. Time to think. Time to figure out how to handle what's happened. Time to construct a story that will hold when she's eventually discovered. If you place a body and you know it won't be found for hours, what do you do with that time? You use it, you prepare, you write a ransom note, you maybe stage other elements of the scene. You get your story straight. You call your lawyer. You do all the things that require clear thinking and privacy and time that you wouldn't have if the body were discovered immediately. The undisturbed positioning gave someone that time, hours of it, hours where they could work on managing the situation while being confident that the most significant piece of evidence, JonBenet's body, would remain exactly where they'd left it, waiting to be found only when the time was right. We've circled through the positioning evidence from every angle: logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and from the perspective of someone who needed time to manage a crisis of their own making. And every angle points to the same conclusion. JonBenet was placed deliberately, positioned carefully, and left undisturbed for hours while other things were arranged. That's not what happens in a chaotic kidnapping attempt. That's what happens when someone in a controlled environment needs time to think and knows they can create that time by placing a body where it won't be immediately found. The position preserves truth. And the truth it preserves is that this was never about strangers and chaos. It was about control and time and someone who knew exactly what they were doing when they left her there to wait in stillness. Theme 2. The hours that passed in darkness. Let's focus on those hours. The hours between when JonBenet was placed in the basement and when she was found. Approximately 12 hours, give or take, based on the biological evidence. 12 hours where she lay in the darkness of that small room alone, while upstairs a completely different story was unfolding. 12 hours where the house filled with police and friends and investigators, where a ransom note was being analyzed, where everyone waited for a phone call that would never come, all while she was already there, already gone, already positioned exactly where she would eventually be discovered. Think about what those 12 hours represent. They represent a gap, a space between event and discovery, a buffer zone where someone could think, could plan, could construct a narrative without the immediate pressure of having to explain a body. And that gap wasn't accidental. It was created by the decision to place her in that specific location, in that specific way, knowing it would buy time. 12 hours is a long time when you're in crisis. It's long enough to move from shock to planning, long enough to write a 3-page ransom note, long enough to stage elements of a scene, long enough to call a lawyer before the police have even begun to suspect you of anything, long enough to compose yourself, to get your story straight, to make sure that when discovery finally comes, you're ready for it. But it's also a long time to leave someone you care about alone in the dark. And that ability to leave her there, to walk away and stay away for all those hours, tells us something about the person who placed her there. It tells us they had extraordinary self-control, or that their fear of what discovery would mean was stronger than their grief about leaving her alone, or that they'd compartmentalized so thoroughly that they could separate the fact of her body in the basement from the performance of desperate parent upstairs. Let's examine those hours from multiple perspectives, because the length of time matters almost as much as the positioning itself. From a logical standpoint, 12 undisturbed hours tells us several things. It tells us the person who placed her wasn't coming back to check on her, to adjust her positioning, to second-guess the decision about where to put her. They placed her once and committed to that placement. That suggests confidence in the decision. Confidence that the location would keep her undiscovered until the right moment. Confidence that they wouldn't need to interact with her body again until it was time for discovery. It also tells us they had control over who searched where in the house, because the basement room where JonBenet was found wasn't immediately searched when police arrived. Various accounts suggest that certain areas of the house were cursorily checked, but the specific room where she lay wasn't thoroughly searched until much later. How is that possible unless someone was managing what got searched and when? Unless someone was directing attention towards certain areas and away from others? Unless someone knew exactly where not to look until the time came for her to be found? From a philosophical perspective, time itself becomes a weapon in this scenario. Time is distance. The more time passes between when something happens and when it's discovered, the harder it becomes to establish precise timelines. Biological processes that could pin down time of passing to a narrow window become less precise. Memories become fuzzier. The sequence of events becomes harder to reconstruct with certainty. Time erodes evidence, both physical and testimonial, so 12 hours isn't just a gap, it's protection. Protection against the kind of precise timeline reconstruction that could reveal inconsistencies in the story being told. If JonBenet had been found immediately after she was lost, the timeline would be tight, precise, harder to manipulate. But with 12 hours of buffer, with biological processes having time to progress, with everyone's memories becoming colored by emotion and confusion, the timeline becomes murkier. And in that murkiness, there's room for the story to shift, to accommodate, to avoid the kind of precision that would expose contradictions. Psychologically, those 12 hours represent something almost unbearable to contemplate. Someone in that house knew where JonBenet was, knew she was alone in the basement, knew she'd been gone for hours. And they continued to participate in the fiction that she'd been taken by kidnappers. continued to wait for a phone call they knew wouldn't come, continued to engage with police and friends and investigators while maintaining the performance of desperate uncertainty. That level of sustained deception, not just lying, but maintaining a complete false reality for hours, requires enormous psychological resources. You can't let yourself think about the truth. You have to stay in the fiction, have to believe it on some level, or at least perform belief so thoroughly that it becomes indistinguishable from actual belief. And the longer you maintain that performance, the more invested you become in it. The harder it becomes to ever acknowledge the truth, because acknowledgement would mean admitting you sustained the fiction for all those hours while she lay alone in the basement. From a physiological standpoint, maintaining that level of performance under acute stress takes a toll. Your cortisol levels remain elevated. Your nervous system stays in a state of high arousal. You're constantly monitoring your behavior, your words, your reactions, making sure nothing slips, nothing reveals the truth you're hiding. That's exhausting. It's why people under that kind of pressure often make mistakes, small slips that reveal what they know but aren't saying. But the person who placed JonBenet in that basement and then sustained the fiction for 12 hours didn't make obvious mistakes, or at least not obvious enough that anyone stopped the performance and demanded the truth. They maintained control, maintained the story, kept everyone looking outward for kidnappers while she waited in the darkness below. That level of control under stress suggests either exceptional compartmentalization or previous experience with managing high-stress situations where maintaining composure was critical. It's not the behavior of someone in complete psychological breakdown. It's the behavior of someone who's functioning, who's thinking strategically even while in crisis, who understands that maintaining the performance is the only way to protect themselves from what would happen if the truth came out. Forensic criminology gives us frameworks for understanding concealment behavior, and one pattern that emerges in cases where bodies are hidden in or near the home is the attempt to control discovery. The person who conceals the body often tries to influence when and how it's found. They might discover it themselves, creating a scenario that explains their presence near it. They might guide others to the location when the time feels right. They might create distractions or delays that buy them time to prepare for the discovery. And that pattern fits what we see in the Ramsey case. JonBenet wasn't found by police during their initial search. She was found by John in a part of the house that hadn't been thoroughly searched earlier, at a moment when the kidnapping story was starting to fracture under the weight of the missing phone call and the lack of any real leads. The timing of discovery, coming after those 12 hours, coming when the investigation was starting to shift, suggests it wasn't entirely accidental. It suggests someone knew where to look, and knew when the time was right to look there. From an anthropological perspective, those 12 hours represent a kind of liminal space, a threshold time between one reality and another. Upstairs, the house operates under the reality of a kidnapping. Police present, friends gathered, everyone waiting for contact from kidnappers. Downstairs, in the darkness, there's a different reality. The truth of what actually happened, waiting to be acknowledged. And someone in that house was navigating between those two realities, participating in the upstairs fiction while knowing the downstairs truth, existing in both spaces simultaneously, unable to fully inhabit either. That's a profound psychological split. And maintaining it for 12 hours, maintaining the performance of not knowing while knowing exactly where she was, that requires a kind of dissociation that most people couldn't sustain. Finally, let's think about those hours from the perspective of someone who's trying to protect themselves. 12 hours of buffer means 12 hours where the story can be refined, where elements can be staged, where a lawyer can be called and consulted, where whatever needs to be managed can be managed before the inevitable discovery brings everything crashing down. The person who created those 12 hours by placing JonBenet in that remote basement room understood the value of time, understood that immediate discovery would be catastrophic, would create a timeline too tight to manipulate, would force explanations that couldn't be given, so they created distance, created a gap, created hours where the fiction could solidify, where the story could be practiced, where everyone could get into their roles before the curtain came up on Act 2, the discovery. We've examined those 12 hours from every angle we can, and what emerges is a picture of time as a tool. Time as protection. Time as the space between event and consequence where stories can be built and control can be maintained. Those hours weren't empty. They were full of activity upstairs, phone calls, note writing, people gathering, stories being told. And full of stillness below, JonBenet waiting in darkness while biological processes marked the passage of time her body would eventually bear witness to. The hours that passed in darkness tell us this was never about chaos or panic. It was about control, about managing discovery, about creating the space and time necessary to build a story that would point away from the truth. And someone in that house understood exactly how to create that space, exactly where to place her so she'd remain undiscovered, exactly how long they could wait before discovery became necessary. That understanding doesn't come from panic. It comes from familiarity, from knowing the house, from knowing the rhythms of investigation, from knowing how to manage time when time is the only thing standing between you and the truth you can't afford to face. Theme 3. The staging that came after stillness. Now let's talk about something that the positioning evidence reveals when we really look at it carefully. The staging, the ropes, the tape, the various elements that were supposed to make this look like a kidnapping attempt, appears to have been applied after JonBenet had already been gone for some time. Not during. After. After rigor mortis had begun to set. After her body had started the biological processes that would eventually tell us how long she'd been lying there undisturbed. This is crucial because it tells us about sequence, about what happened when. And the sequence matters enormously because it reveals intent and planning rather than panic and chaos. Think about what it means to stage elements on a body after biological processes have begun. It means you're not staging in the moment, in the heat of crisis, trying desperately to create a scenario that will explain what just happened. You're staging later, after time has passed, after you've had a chance to think, after rigor mortis has made the body less present, less like the person you knew and more like an object that needs to be arranged to tell a particular story. That delayed staging tells us several things. It tells us the person doing it had the time and space to think about what needed to be staged, had the emotional distance or the compartmentalization to interact with a body that was no longer newly gone but had been lying there for hours, had the ability to approach this as a problem to be solved rather than a moment of overwhelming emotion. Let's examine what the staging tells us from multiple perspectives because the details matter. The way things were staged, when they were staged, what they were supposed to communicate. All of this reveals the mind behind the staging. From a logical standpoint, if you're staging a kidnapping attempt gone wrong, you'd do it in the moment or very shortly after. You'd create the appearance of struggle, of binding that was meant to control a victim, of elements that make sense in the timeline you're trying to establish. But if you stage hours later, after the body has cooled, after rigor mortis has begun, the staging doesn't quite fit the timeline you're trying to sell. It's anachronistic. It suggests events happened in a sequence other than what you're claiming. And that's what we see. The ropes, for instance, don't show evidence of struggle against them. They're tied, but loosely, in ways that suggest they were applied to someone who wasn't moving, wasn't resisting. The tape similarly doesn't show the kind of placement you'd expect if it were applied to control a struggling child. It's there, but it's almost superficial. like it's performing the idea of restraint rather than actually functioning as restraint. That superficiality makes sense if the staging happened after. If these elements were added not to control JonBenet but to create a visual story for whoever would eventually find her. To make it look like a kidnapping attempt. To give investigators something to focus on other than the question of who in the house had access to her, who had time with her, who would have known where to place her and how long she could remain undiscovered. From a philosophical perspective, staging reveals a kind of narrative desperation. The person doing it understands that a body will be found and that body needs to tell a story. But the story can't be the truth. So you create a false story through visual elements, through props that suggest external criminals and violent intentions, through elements that point away from what actually happened and toward a fiction that might be believed. But staging always carries the risk of revealing itself, because staged elements often don't quite fit. They're too neat or too messy, too carefully arranged or too haphazardly thrown together. They communicate, "This is what I want you to think happened," rather than "this is what actually happened." And careful investigators can often tell the difference by looking at consistency, at whether the staged elements make sense in the context of what they're supposed to represent. Psychologically, being able to stage elements on someone you knew, especially on a child, requires a profound level of dissociation. You have to separate the body from the person, have to see it as an object to be arranged rather than someone you cared about. That separation is possible, but it's not easy. And it leaves traces in how the staging is done. Often you'll see hesitation marks, elements that are started but not completed. Staging that seems uncertain, like the person doing it couldn't quite commit fully to what they were doing. Or conversely, you'll see staging that's too deliberate, too thought out, revealing that this wasn't done in a moment of panic but after careful consideration of what would be most convincing. In JonBenet's case, the staging has that quality of being thought out but not quite committed. The ropes are there but not tight. The tape is there but not firmly applied. There are elements that suggest someone went through the motions of creating a kidnapping scene but couldn't quite bring themselves to fully commit to the brutality that would make it convincing. Because committing to that brutality would mean confronting what they were doing, staging on the body of someone they knew, someone they'd cared for. And that confrontation was perhaps too much to bear fully. From a physiological standpoint, staging after rigor mortis has begun creates practical challenges. A body in rigor is stiff, difficult to manipulate. Positioning limbs, tying ropes, applying tape, all of this becomes harder when the body isn't flexible. And the difficulty of working with a body in rigor often shows in the staging. Elements end up positioned in ways that don't quite make sense because the person doing the staging was working around the constraints of rigor mortis, rather than being able to position things naturally. That awkwardness can be visible in crime scene photos and evidence, ropes that don't quite follow the contours they should. Positioning that seems forced or unnatural. Elements that look applied rather than integrated. All of this suggests staging done after the body had already been lying undisturbed long enough for biological processes to begin making it less pliable, less responsive to manipulation. Forensic criminology teaches us to distinguish between staging that's part of the original event and staging that's applied after. And one key marker is lividity, the blood pooling we talked about earlier. If you stage before lividity sets, you might be able to position the body in ways that make the staging look more authentic. But if you stage after, the lividity pattern will contradict the staged position. It will show that the body was lying differently before the staging was applied, that it was moved or repositioned after blood had already begun to settle. And that contradiction between where blood pooled and how the body is finally positioned can reveal that staging happened in stages, that the body was first placed in one position and left there while biological processes began. Then later, someone came back and applied staging elements, but by then the lividity had already begun to fix, creating a mismatch that careful forensic analysis can detect. From an anthropological perspective, the way we stage crime scenes reflects our understanding of what crimes should look like. We draw on cultural knowledge, movies, news reports, other cases we've heard about, to create scenarios that match our expectations of how certain crimes unfold. And that cultural knowledge can actually make staging less believable to experts because real crimes don't look like movie crimes. They're messier, more chaotic, less visually coherent. The staging in this case has that quality of being drawn from cultural expectations rather than criminal reality. The elements that are supposed to suggest kidnapping, the ropes, the tape, the note itself, they all reference ideas about kidnapping rather than how kidnappings actually work. They're performing kidnapping in a way that suggests the person staging them was drawing on media representations rather than actual criminal knowledge. And that performance quality is revealing, because it suggests someone trying to create a scenario they don't actually understand from the inside. Someone who knows what kidnappings are supposed to look like, but not what they actually look like. Someone operating from cultural knowledge rather than criminal experience. Finally, let's think about the staging from the perspective of someone who needs to create a story that will protect them. The body is going to be found, eventually. That's unavoidable. But how it's found, what story it seems to tell, that can be influenced. So you stage. You create visual elements that point toward external criminals. You create a scenario that makes it look like someone broke in, tried to take her, something went wrong. You create distance between yourself and what happened by creating the appearance of otherness, strangers, intruders, people with violent intent. But the staging has to be done carefully. Too much and it looks obviously staged. Too little and it doesn't tell the story you need it to tell. And doing it after the fact, after you've had time to think, but also after rigor mortis has begun to set, that creates its own challenges. You're working with a body that's becoming less pliable, less responsive to positioning. You're trying to create a scenario that should have happened hours ago, but you're creating it now, with evidence accumulating that will eventually reveal the timeline doesn't quite match the story. We've examined the staging from every angle, and what emerges is a picture of someone trying to create a false narrative through physical elements applied after the fact. Someone who understood that the body would tell a story but wanted to control what story it told. Someone who had the time and space and emotional distance to approach this as a problem to be solved. How do I make this look like something other than what it was, rather than as an immediate emotional crisis they were responding to in the moment? The staging that came after stillness reveals planning, reveals control, reveals someone managing a situation rather than being overwhelmed by it, and all of that points away from chaos and towards something more deliberate. Something that happened within the household, by someone who had the time and access to stage elements after biological processes had already begun their work. Someone who knew they could take their time because discovery could be delayed, managed, controlled. Someone who understood exactly how to position a body and how to stage a scene and how to create a story that would point investigators away from the truth waiting to be discovered in the darkness of that basement room. Outro. We've walked through what JonBenet's body tells us when we listen to its biological testimony. We've seen how the positioning reveals careful placement followed by hours of undisturbed time. How the rigor mortis and livor mortis patterns tell us she lay in one position long enough for these processes to complete their work. How the staging appears to have been applied after, not during, revealing planning and control rather than panic and chaos. And all of this evidence points to the same conclusion. She never left that house. She was never meant to leave. The kidnapping was a fiction created to explain her absence. But her body tells us she was never absent at all. She was exactly where she was placed, waiting in stillness while a different story was being written upstairs. while a ransom note was being composed, while police were being called, while friends gathered and a lawyer arrived and everyone waited for a phone call that would never come. The body doesn't lie. It can't be made to forget. It can't be convinced to tell a story other than the one written into its tissues and biological processes. And the story JonBenet's body tells is one of deliberate placement, extended time, and staging applied after the fact. It tells us someone knew exactly where to put her, knew she could remain undiscovered for hours, knew how to manage that time to create space for other elements of the story to be arranged. Next time, we'll look more closely at those staged elements, the ropes, the tape, the theatrical touches that were supposed to convince everyone this was the work of dangerous intruders. We'll examine how they were applied, what they were supposed to communicate, and why they don't quite work as evidence of what we've been told happened. Because the staging, like everything else in this case, tells two stories. The story it's meant to tell, kidnapping attempt, violence, external threat. And the story it actually tells when you look closely, hesitation, superficiality, someone trying to create the appearance of a crime that never occurred while working around the constraints of a body that had already been lying still for hours. The staging falls apart when you examine it. And in that falling apart, the truth becomes visible. The truth that was there all along, waiting to be seen by anyone willing to look past the fiction and into the evidence that refuses to lie.